Former President Muhammadu Buhari is expected to be buried today. According to presidency officials, his remains were expected to arrive on Monday morning at his hometown in Dara, Katsina State from London, where he died on Sunday at the age of 82. He had been receiving medical treatment in London in recent weeks. Buhari led Nigeria's first in the 1980s following a military coup, and then again 3 decades later for 2 terms. He was the first opposition candidate to win a presidential election in 2015 and led Africa's most populous nation until 2023. However, by the end of his 8-year tenure, his goodwill for ending killings and tackling corruption had turned into discontent, with more Nigerians dying due to growing insecurity and corruption. He was succeeded by current President Bola Tinubu, who has ordered flags at half-mast as a mark of respect. Many Nigerians have been mourning his death.
For the bereaved, the family at large, at least my condolence to them. So Buhari has played his own part. No one is a saint, you understand? We are missing Buhari now when the president isn't in place. So I can still tell you for the truth, we are still missing Buhari.
Well, to discuss this further, we are joined by Christopher Ogunmodede, a policy analyst and consultant. He specializes in African politics and international relations. He joins us from Lagos via Zoom. Chris, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. How would you describe the legacy of Nigeria's former president, Muhammadu Buhari?
For me, I would describe Buhari's legacy as one of unfulfilled objectives and a missed opportunity to transform this country. And I say that for one main reason only, partly part of it you've alluded to, the fact that he was the first opposition candidate to win the presidency in Nigeria. You know, I remember 2015, May 29th, when he was sworn in. It was a time of immense hope, goodwill. He'd won a fairly convincing election in some very triumphant circumstances, having lost 3 previous elections overwhelmingly, as a matter of fact. For him then to cobble the coalition required to do that, and having campaigned what was frankly a watershed in Nigeria's electoral politics, there was so much hope, there was so much optimism, there was so much aspiration. You know, he'd campaigned on being this austere individual with lots of integrity who had ruled Nigeria during the military eras of the past, and he was going to reprise what he had set out to do in the 80s but wasn't able to complete because he was overthrown. So he had this narrative that Nigerians bought and expected so much of, and they gave him, you know, a lot of their goodwill, and there was so much optimism that quickly whittled away because he was unable to meet the demands of the job.
Well, let's talk more about that optimism and letdown. There are those who say Buhari's leadership fell short in terms of addressing the major challenges facing Nigeria, that which you alluded to. What's your take on that?
They're correct. Buhari, by many metrics, whether it's per capita income, debts, just over the overwhelming sense of Nigeria's emergence as, you know, one of the world's emerging powers. You know, I remember in the 2000s, the late 2000s, going into the 2010s, when Nigeria was talked about as one of the mint countries, right? Mexico, Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria was the N in that mint, you know. But you know, there were some economic difficulties by the mid-2010s, which stalled that momentum, which also sort of gave way to Buhari's emergence. And as he came into power, he promised to transform the country politically, economically, and even the culture of how Nigerians go about their daily lives in the business and the civil service. There was so much that Buhari promised that he would do for this country. And the fact that, first of all, he comes into office 6 months without a government, that was a loss of momentum that frankly he never recovered from. But even still, Nigerians were willing to be patient because they recognized these were tough economic times. The previous regime had really bungled the economy of this country, but he never seemed to actually rise to the occasion. In fairness, he had some health challenges during his first term. There was a period in time where he was in London seeking treatment his vice president stepped in as the acting president. But in some ways, that was kind of a precursor for what was going to come later, and that was sort of the beginning of the end of the loss of goodwill that, as I've mentioned several times, that he came into power with, and he never seemed to connect emotionally with the difficulties and challenges and even aspirations that Nigerians face. So I would say that that verdict that you've described about the Buhari legacy is correct.
All right, let's circle back a little bit and talk about this goodwill and this great expectation that the Nigerian people had for Buhari before he took power. Buhari became the first opposition candidate to win a presidential election in Nigeria, which is a great milestone. Does this adequately show that he did, in fact, have a wide acceptance and goodwill from the citizens?
To the extent that an election result can demonstrate that, and generally speaking, there's a paucity of polling data in Nigeria, generally speaking, about public opinion on a range of topics. But to the extent that one can read an election result and say so, I would say so. Again, as I alluded to, this was a candidate who, in previous elections, had often lost by 10 million votes. 15 million votes, 17 million votes. And then on the fourth try, he comes and wins by more than 2 million votes. When you look at the shifts, in the patterns of the percentage of the share of the vote that he'd gotten, and on the fourth try, finally wins this. And when you look at the spread of his vote, he used to win elections mostly in Nigeria's what we call the core north, the northwest and the northeast. But by the time he wins the election, he wins the majority of the votes in the southwest part of Nigeria. He does pretty well in the north central, and of course does well in the northeast and the northwest. So you see a shift in the spread of his votes. He comes into office, even many parts of the country where people did not vote for him, nonetheless held out hope that we didn't vote for him, but we want Buhari to do well, because if Buhari does well, Nigeria does well. Nigeria must thrive. We're going through difficult times, but we understand that things will take some time to turn around. Buhari never quite met them halfway as far as that expectations. There was always a series of excuses as to why certain things hadn't happened. He would often justify his inertia. One of the nicknames for him at that time was Baba Go Slow, and he embraced the label that, hey, look, things are very difficult. I have to go slow. But, there wasn't a sense of I have to go slow in this instant, but here's what I will do in the meantime. He was terrible, frankly, at communicating with the public. He was aloof. He would travel frequently for reasons that were very often unexplained. Sometimes, of course, they would be to do with his health, but that lack of a connection and communication with Nigerians is a big part of why his popularity whittled. Though he did win re-election, but elections in many ways are not the true test of a politician's popularity, especially when you consider the factor of the incumbency advantage and things like that.
All right, Christopher Ogunmodede, international relations expert, thanks for that. CGTN's Robert Nagila looks back at Muhammadu Buhari's presidency.
Muhammadu Buhari first led Nigeria as a military ruler following a coup against the democratically elected government of President Shehu Shagari in 1983. He quickly made a name for himself over his tough stance on corruption and disorder. But less than 2 years later, he was ousted in another military coup. Buhari was born on December 17, 1942, in Daura, Katsina State. He joined the military after secondary school, gradually rising to the rank of Major General. In 1984, he was appointed executive chairman of the Petroleum Trust Fund by President Sani Abacha. He joined politics in 2003 and lost the presidential election to Olusegun Obasanjo, another former military ruler. In 2015, he won the presidential election against incumbent President Goodluck Jonathan, becoming the country's 15th president. His second stint was marred by violence in the northeastern part of the country by jihadist group Boko Haram, Nigeria's fast recession, and militant attacks on oil fields in the south. He was re-elected for a second term in 2019 and stepped down in 2023. Buhari was married twice and had 10 children. Robert Nagila, CGTN.